Hello, my dear friends. I'm gladly greeting you again. We are going on Periscope depth. And once again, Major Scott Ritter is my very welcome guest. Hello. How are you
Hello.
doing, sir?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
That's great. That's great to know. I'm fine, thank you. Well, a little bit overwhelmed with my duties as a deputy editor, so it comes with a job. So, sir, last time we met, it was more than a month ago. A lot of things have happened. I just wanted to ask you a brief overview what happened in Ukraine, which is worth mentioning, to your opinion.
I mean, it's a continuation of the same trends that existed a month ago, but they're reaching culmination. I mean, when we spoke last time, I made it clear that my assessment is that Ukraine is losing this conflict, and that Ukraine will lose this conflict, and their defeat will be decisive, and that it will be sometime this year. I continue to believe all of that. There's nothing that's happened to alter that analysis. In fact, what's happening only confirms the analysis. The battle for Bakhmut or Artyomsk, I can't. Am I pronouncing that incorrectly?
You're absolutely correct.
Okay, is coming to its tragic conclusion. And when I say tragic, I mean the loss of humanity on both sides has been considerable for Ukrainians. It has been backbreaking, according to the to both Ukraine and Russian sources. The level of casualties that have been incurred on the Ukrainians is beyond comprehension. Um, Ukrainians, there's a lot of talk about a spring offensive, but one has to wonder, how do you turn rhetoric into reality? Where is this equipment going to come from? Where is the manpower going to come from? Um, how do they plan on attacking Russian defenses that have been prepared in depth for months now? And how do they deal with the fact that the Russians continue to carry out comprehensive offensive operations throughout the length of the line of contact? The West is getting exhausted from this war. Again, rhetoric is one thing, reality is another. The quantity and quality of equipment is starting to diminish, along with the political willingness to continue to underwrite this war, this very expensive war. There's a lot of pressure being put on Ukraine by the West to accept a negotiated settlement. Um, Russia has made it clear they have specific objectives that have to be fulfilled, and that they're not going to negotiate those away, that any negotiation would have to meet all Russian objectives. So whether the two can come together, we'll see. I think that there's still a lot of fighting left. There's going to be some very violent fighting, bloody fighting. Both sides are going to suffer casualties, but Russia is on track to achieve the strategic defeat of the Ukrainian military by the end of summer, early fall of this year. The political aspects of this conflict, politics are always more complicated. And how Russia achieves denazification hasn't been articulated by Russia itself. So we don't know what their plan is. I've spoken to some people who talk about, you know, sort of military law for a period of time, re-education, tribunals, arrests, imprisonment. And again, that's rhetoric. Turning that rhetoric into reality is always a challenge. So I think Russia has an easier task defeating the Ukrainian military, and a more difficult task coming up with a way to bring conflict termination, and yet on terms that are acceptable to Russia, but also acceptable to the West. I mean, Russia at some point in time will have to make a decision how they want this war to end. And understanding that if their conditions are too stark, then the West won't concede, and the war could continue with tragic consequences. Again, every death is a tragedy. So we'll see what happens with the politics. But this is a this is still a conflict that Russia has all the advantages. There's no disadvantages for Russia right now.
Yeah, a couple of days ago, I did have a live stream where my viewers were asking questions and I was answering them. There was a question about Odessa. And I figured that the best way for Odessa would be sucking off the military of the city. I mean, so pulling it off to someplace another where they need it. So Odessa would be way more empty city. I mean, the military, Ukrainian military. And that would, in some point, be easier not to turn Odessa into Mariupol when it comes to storming the city. Or maybe the storming would not be necessary. What do you think about it?
One of the problems with war is that the enemy always gets a vote. So it doesn't matter what you want. It matters what the enemy wants as well. And it's my belief that Russia cherishes Odessa. It is a city of historic importance. It's not just a city of contemporary value, but one of historic cultural importance. And Russia would be loath to see it put to the sword, so to speak. I don't believe Russia wants a repeat of Mariupol anywhere, but especially in a city like Odessa. But it's not just Russia's choice. I mean, Russia will do what it has to do to achieve its stated objectives. But this is why I've always believed that when Vladimir Putin answered the question from the Hungarian journalist last summer, that answer was extraordinarily important. I'm somebody who actually listens to what the Russian president says and respects the fact that he's a man who isn't trivial. When he says things, there's thought behind it, and that we should respect his words. So when he indicated that Odessa could be the key to military victory or the key to peace, I take him very seriously. And so I know there's a lot of Russian people. I always, emotions run high. And I always speak about the potential of a peace settlement that leaves Odessa in Ukrainian hands. And they say, never, never, never. Well, they're not the Russian president. They don't have the weight of tens of thousands of lives on their shoulders. They don't have the future of their country on their shoulders. They don't have to live with the consequences of destroying a city of the cultural and historic value of Odessa. Vladimir Putin does. And I also think that he thinks strategically, meaning that while there may be animosity and rancor today between Russia and Ukraine, at some point in time, the Russian vision must be to peacefully coexist with Ukraine as neighbors, not as enemies. And as such, if there is a way to terminate this conflict, demilitarize Odessa, have it an open city under Ukrainian sovereign control, but one that respects its Russian heritage and is tolerant of a Russian population and Russian language and religion, etc., where Russians can freely travel to and fro, that's not a bad outcome. That's not a bad outcome compared to the alternative, which would be to assault the city, raise the city, destroy the city. You know, in Vietnam, there was a saying, we had to destroy the village to save the village. And if you reflect on that, that's about as dumb as it can get. So if the concept is you have to destroy Odessa to save Odessa, you might want to rethink your approach. But again, both sides have a vote on this. I have said all along that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government have been the adults in the room. That while the children scream and gnash and tear things apart, the adults stand back and think, beyond the chaos. But how do we get them to lunch? How do we get them to take a nap? How do we get them, through the day? Um, and I believe that that's the role the Russian government's playing right now. It's frustrating for people who will allow their emotions to be overtaken by the tragedy of this war. I'm not being critical of those people. You're talking to somebody who can get very emotional himself about issues. I know what anger is. I know what frustration is. But I also know that if you sleep on an issue, when you wake up in the morning, oftentimes you have a wiser approach to separate yourself from the emotion and think about the practicalities. And that's Vladimir Putin's job. His job is to sleep on the issue, separate himself from the emotion, and think about the practicalities. So I personally believe that the Russian government, and again, I listened to his speech on February 21st. There was no talk about taking Odessa. There was no talk about taking Dnipropetrovsk. There was no talk about taking Kharkov. Those are three cities with significant Russian populations that easily, if there was a referendum, you could achieve the votes necessary to justify annexation. But he's not talking about that because the Russian goal has never been to annex Ukrainian territory. Russia was compelled to do so because of Ukrainian actions and because of the will of the people residing in those territories. But if this war can come to an end, I would hasten to bet that if you went and interviewed an ethnic Russian in Odessa and gave them a choice if your choice is live under the heel of a Nazified Ukrainian government or have the Russian army come in and liberate you regardless of the consequence, I believe many would have the Russian army come in and liberate us, whatever the consequence. But that the goal is to live in a peaceful Odessa, free of oppression, paying taxes to a Ukrainian government that is tolerant of your religion, your ethnicity, your language, and being able to freely interact with Russia so that you don't lose that connectivity, all the while living in a city that has been untouched by war. I think people would take that. That's not a bad option, especially if you say you get to have your children, they're alive, your parents are alive, your friends are alive, your colleagues are alive. There are many people in Mariupol and Bakhmut. I apologize for fumbling that word, and elsewhere who can't say the same thing. They can't say their children are alive. They can't say their parents are alive. They can't say their friends are alive, their colleagues are alive, because they died in the battle for those cities. And if you ask them, was it worth it? That'd be a tough question to answer. What is the price you give for your children? What is the price for your parents? What is the price for your friends, for your family? And so I think that's the thought process right now regarding Odessa. But again, I don't know. This is just analysis. I don't have my red phone that I can pick up, push the button, and talk to the Russian president. So this is speculation made by an American thousands of miles removed from the problem. Vladimir Putin's statement was made in the summer of 2022. A lot has happened since then. And there are more factors that must be considered by him and the rest of the Russian government. So perhaps their thinking has changed, but nothing can change the fact that you don't want to be in a situation where in order to save Odessa, you have to destroy Odessa.
Yeah. By all means, Vladimir Putin is one of the most sober-minded leaders, which I know. And right now you just touched the nerve because I feel the most lucky guy. Because my father, my aunt, my cousin, my father's wife, and some friends, they all survived the battle for Mariupol. They all came out, made it out alive. So I can't just even say anything about the choice our president does have, because all of my dear ones are alive, and lucky me, and that's why my mouth is shut on this question. I cannot just sitting over here where no bullet flying over me, saying whether I want this or that. It's not a choice for me to make. Yeah, and I'm saying this mostly for those of you, my dear friends, who thinks it's an easy job to be a president. Nothing like that.
No.
It's not an easy job even for Joe Biden, by the way, no matter how we don't like him.
One of the things we do in the United States is we always take a photograph of a president's face on the day of inauguration,
Mm-hmm.
and how fresh it is, how youthful the face looks. And then take a photograph of that face even 4 years later, how tired the face is, how worn out the face is. The job of leading a major world power is it's life altering. And then if they do that for 8 years, they look even more worn out. Again, regardless if you like their politics or you don't like their politics, it doesn't matter. The job is difficult. What I can say, though, if you take a look at Vladimir Putin's face, it's aged, but that's because he's been in office for 23, 24 years.
Yeah.
We all age after 24 years, but there's still a radiance there. There's still a vibrance that tells me that, he, for a man who was the most unlikely president Russia's ever had, a man who didn't seek the office. The office was thrust upon him. He didn't want it. He has grown into this job. I don't want to sound too much like a sycophant, because I understand that there's no such thing as the perfect person. But that's okay. We're humans. That's what we are, imperfect. That's what makes us wonderful.
Absolutely.
If I were a Russian and I were religious, I would wake up every morning and give a prayer of thanks that God delivered to my nation this man at this time. Because if you go back and study, and I've spent a lot of time reading up on it, the succession from Yeltsin, what was going on around Boris Yeltsin at the time, the pack of wolves that were surrounding him, waiting to eat Russia up when Yeltsin stepped aside.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. And I'll say that one more time. Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. It was luck or divine intervention, but it happened. And look at Russia today. For all the people that are out there critical of Putin, and believe me, I mean, my God, of course we can criticize anybody. Nobody's perfect.
Absolutely.
Russia's a huge country, a huge country. The complexity of governing Russia, I don't know if even Russians reflect on it sometimes. The span that you're talking about. How many time zones are you guys? 11 time zones, 14? I don't know, but it's a lot of time zones. It's a big country.
Yeah.
And so just communication alone is complicated. In America, I have to wait 3 hours to call Los Angeles. In Russia, you got to wait 12 hours to call Vladivostok. I mean, it's just the time difference is crazy.
Yeah.
So, and I might be wrong on that. I know people are going to come on. No, Scott, it's only 8 hours. Okay, I'm making a point, not trying to be specific here, but and the fact that Russia has been led through, and again, most of us, when we want to start a job, you want to start in a building that's intact, the basement, the foundation is solid, the phones work, you have connectivity, you have a staff, and all that stuff. But if someone said, hey, we're going to hire you to a job, and you show up and the building's been burned down, the basement's flooded, there's no communication, no electricity, you don't have a desk, you don't have anything. And you have to start right now to fix it because you got a war going on in Chechnya that the CIA is trying to use to tear your country apart. That would be a nightmare. That's the state of Russia that Vladimir Putin inherited. A nation in total disarray, totally dysfunctional, corruption beyond imagination. And he has taken you to where you are today. Is it perfect? No. Is there still corruption? Yes. He'll even admit that. How do you go from being what was in Yeltsin Russia in the 1990s, this decrepit, swamp-infested, sewer-ridden country? And I'm not saying that that's Russia. I'm saying that's what Boris Yeltsin did to Russia. To where you are today, where hopefully in a little bit I'll get to see it firsthand. But from what I see from a distance is a modern nation with good infrastructure, with good services, where when you go to the government does what it's supposed to do without you having to put bribes under the table. The law, you can, there's predictability in the courts, meaning that there is a law that the courts adhere to. You know where you stand, what the left and right limits are. To me, the transformation is just beyond imagination. Maybe for Russians who experienced it one day at a time, you don't see that because it's been gradual. So you've just gradually grown to accept this gradually improving situation as the norm. And if that's the case, then the complaints that you had in the 1990s continue to follow you through. But if you could make a time jump from then to now, knowing full well what then was, and then compare and contrast it to the now, there would be no complaints. None. And this is the sole responsibility of Vladimir Putin. He's not a dictator, but he's one hell of a leader. And Russia's been blessed by him. And frankly speaking, the world has been blessed by him, because if we had a lesser man in a position of power in Russia, subjected to the pressures that he's been put on by nations that hate Russia, hate him, we might not be here today, because a lesser man might have taken some of this stuff personally and responded in a way that led to a conflict. So someday I hope the world will look back once history can be written, the facts are known, and analysis can be made free of the pressures of the immediate moment, and say, well, I'll give you an example. We have a president, Jimmy Carter. And I have to tell you, when Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States, I did not like Jimmy Carter. Not at all. I didn't know him as a person, just as a leader. I'm like, no. But when you, over time, the first thing comes out is what a good man he is. What a good man he is. That still doesn't mean he's a good leader, but what a good man he is. And the importance about knowing that he's a good man means that when you go back and you evaluate the decisions he made as president, you have to understand that it came from a place of purity, that he wasn't a bad person trying to use the office of the presidency for personal gain. He was a good man trying to make the right decision for the benefit of the country. And you also have to understand that he inherited a mess, a horrible mess. Not quite as bad as what Boris Yeltsin did to Russia, but come on, Richard Nixon, what Richard Nixon did to American politics because of Watergate, the state that the Americans were in, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the oil embargo, what did to our economy, the state of race relations, post-Vietnam malaise. If you look at all the issues that were piled up on Jimmy Carter's desk when he assumed office, they would compete with many of the issues that were piled up on Vladimir Putin's desk, including issues about how we deal with other nations. Jimmy Carter had to deal with, Iranian fanatics seizing American diplomats and holding them hostage. He had to deal with, Russia and Afghanistan. Now, we know that that was his fault because of Brzezinski encouraging him. But again, I don't believe that Carter did this because he hated Russia. I think he did it because he was dealing with an America that was weak and a Russia that looked like it was strong. And so how do you weaken Russia? And Brzezinski said Afghanistan. So, it is what it is, the decisions he made. But you go back and you re-examine the Jimmy Carter era, from a defense standpoint, many of the things we give Ronald Reagan credit for, the B-1 bomber, the MX missile, things of that nature, Jimmy Carter did. But he doesn't get any credit for it. He stabilized America after the Nixon debacle. He doesn't get any credit for it. Things that we say Ronald Reagan did, Jimmy Carter did, but because he wasn't a braggart, because he didn't go out there and brag, and because he was hampered by the debacle of Iran, the Iran rescue mission, 8 bodies in the desert. But my point is, when you look at Jimmy Carter today, I think if somebody was writing a history of Jimmy Carter's presidency within 4 years after his presidency and was writing one today, it'd be totally different histories, totally different histories. And so today we have a lot of Americans who are doing instant biographies of Vladimir Putin. And they're full of prejudice, they're full of rancor, they're full of ignorance.